Welcome to Books in the World. My name is Richard Bodertha. I will be your host here today. We're joined by guest Andrew McAleer. Mr. McAleer is an accomplished novelist, an editor, a lawyer, and a U.S. veteran of the Afghanistan campaign. Right now, he has come out with a book called Positive Results, True Stories of Inspiration and Hope for Cancer Fighters and Caregivers. Also, we're here today to talk about his book called The 101 Habits of Highly Successful Novelists. Welcome, Andrew, and thanks for being here.
Richard, thank you for having me. Thank you.
I remember a while ago reading a quote by an author, Sal Bello, who said that writers are generally readers who are pushed to emulate. In other words, they have some knowledge of a writer, or they've read books that they wish to not copy, but emulate. Can you give us a little background on how you got started as a writer, primarily as a fiction writer and detective novelist?
Well, sure. I grew up in a household that was full of novels, from Rex Stout to Mary Higgins Clark, another great Cape Cod writer, to Agatha Christie, you know, and this was really the baseball my father and I shared, as well as my mother was a voracious reader. She loved the Mary Higgins Clark and the Sue Grafton novels. So this is what I grew up with. And my father was an author. My father, John McAleer, he taught at Boston College for many years. He taught crime fiction.
He actually won the Pulitzer Prize for a biography on Emerson, I believe.
He was nominated. He won the Edgar Allan Poe Award for his biography on Rex Stout, who created the Nero Wolfe novels, as you know. So certainly my father was a real big influence, but when I actually, and I had some great teachers along the way who really encouraged my writing. I would write, you know, essays and short stories, and I can't thank, you know, the teachers in my life who really.
Now, where did you grow up? What area?
I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and I would summer at Green Harbor in Marshfield. And
that's off Cape, but it's like a Cape away from the Cape.
It's like the gateway to the Cape.
Okay.
Yes, I would call it. And so, but when I actually started to write, I read many different authors. I would read a lot of English novels, like I said, Agatha Christie, Henry Cecil, some really obscure novelists. But I really loved George Higgins, who was a great Boston novelist. He was actually a great influence on Elmore Leonard. And so I really think I began emulating my first novel, Appearance of Counsel. The characters were really just a complete ripoff of the George Higgins formula.
Well, he was well known for dialogue.
Yes.
And actually in 101 Habits, you even have a section dedicated to dialogue, I believe, about how a writer should go about writing good dialogue in their short story or novel.
Right, and interestingly, I think that might actually be a tip from Elmore Leonard, who was a hugely successful Western author. And this is a great tribute to the to the city of Boston. But when he tried to get into the crime fiction genre, his first novel, I think it was The Big Bounce, got rejected over 80 times. His agent said, "You need to go read George Higgins." He did, and the rest is history. Now Elmore Leonard, you know, Get Shorty, The Big Bounce. He is the
master of
he is of dialogue, and he is the standard for crime fiction today. And it all comes from George Higgins.
What is one of the tips that Elmore Leonard gave you Now, first off, before we get into that, how did you compile all these tips from all these well-known novelists?
Really, I always say it's the generosity of authors. They were really fantastic. And I'll just say I have, it's not all crime authors. There's romance writers, crime, of course, Western authors, sci-fi authors. We try to cover, you know, all the genres of fiction in there. I began corresponding with Elmore Leonard back when I was helping my father put together his book on his conversations with James M. Cain, The Postman Always Rings Twice.
Now, your father was his intent was to write a biography of James M. Cain.
Correct.
Who the author of The Postman Rings Twice.
And Double Indemnity.
Mildred Pierce.
Mildred Pierce, another great novel.
All made into very famous films.
Right,
as well.
right. So, Yes, back in the 70s, after the success of the Rex Stout biography, Cain actually reached out to my father and, wanted him to write his biography. And my father corresponded with Cain quite a bit, and had sent him questionnaires and interview questions. But my father was also teaching graduate school at Boston College at the time, and had a student who actually lived next to James M. Cain.
Down in Baltimore?
Yes, down in Maryland, yeah,
Oh, okay.
Baltimore, Maryland. So he interviewed Cain for about 2 hours and got this treasure trove of, writing tips and just how Cain would structure a novel, how he would create his characters, the significance between first person and third person. And I found these things 30 years later in my father's filing cabinets. I found all these notes and said, Dad, whatever happened to this? What are these doing here? And he told me he was going to write Cain's biography. So it never came to fruition for many, many reasons. And I wrote Elmore Leonard a letter asking what his thoughts were on Cain, because I thought it would be a nice entree.
How long ago was this?
This was probably 2001.
Okay.
And when Cain wrote me back, when Leonard wrote me back, he really praised Cain's writing, but also talked about how Cain really saw the antagonist in the novel. And so Elmore Leonard then started saying how he felt in many ways the antagonist in a crime novel really captures the reader's attention sometimes more than the protagonist. And I thought this was a great little writer tip for the fledgling author to know about. Mm-hmm. So when I when I was asked to write the 101 Habits of Highly Successful Novelists, I said, I'm going to write Elmore Leonard and ask him if I can use some of his correspondence to me as writer's tips. And again, just a very, very gracious gentleman. He said, absolutely, wrote me back, said, sure, go for it. And with Elmore Leonard as an entree, I ended up getting some great authors like William Tapley, who was a wonderful Boston crime writer.
Also Robin Moore, I believe.
Robin Moore.
Was there a connection there with the Cain book, Robin Moore and the Cain?
I know he was a fan of James Cain.
Oh, okay.
But Robin Moore, he was a Concord writer, and he lived in Concord, and he and I became very friendly.
He wrote the French Connection.
He wrote the French Connection, the Green Berets, the Happy Hooker.
Sold, well, how many millions of copies did that sell?
I think it was the best-selling paperback of all time. I don't know if it still is, but it was like, I think somewhere around 19 million copies. So it did
Hollander was their last name, I believe.
Yes,
and that was in the 70s, probably.
Yes, I think it was the early 70s.
I think it sold 20 million copies. Actually.
Yeah, I could be wrong. Hey, I'll settle for 19. But in any event, again, Mary Higgins Clark. She gave me
to know how did you become acquainted with her?
Well, she's a member of the Mystery Writers of America, and I sent her a letter. And when she was first starting out as a novelist, my mother absolutely loved her writing. My father was on the board of directors with the Mystery Writers of America, which, by the way, we have a New England chapter for the Mystery Writers of America, which I would encourage any young crime novelist to really get in touch with and join. Yeah. And they just became very good friends. So I wrote her a letter, introduced myself as John McAleer's son and Ruth McAleer's son, and I said what I was up to, that I was writing a novel that I hoped would help young writers really get in touch with.
Not a novel, but a.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. This is nonfiction.
And she knew of your dad. Your dad.
Yeah, she did know of.
Your dad wrote biographies of many varied people.
Right.
Jane Austen, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yes. Theodore Dreiser.
Wow.
And he also wrote a book on Indian literature, Native American literature. But he was.
And one was the one on Emerson was nominated for the Pulitzer.
Yes, that's correct. That's right. And
well, anyway, back to Higgins Clark. You corresponded with her. She has many tips in here.
Yes, she was very, very generous with what she allowed us to use in the book. And I know I've got some great feedback from a lot of people who have found the book very inspirational. I don't take a lot of credit for it. It's the 101 Habits of Highly Successful Novelists. These are people like Mary Higgins Clark, William Tapley, Elmore Leonard, Jennifer Blake, Lawrence Block. All these people, you know, donated their time and gave some really thoughtful tips. Everything from character creation to plot construction to pacing. Yes, good point. And setting. And it's not just one tip per section. There might be 3 or 4 or 5 tips on plot creation. Another great writer was Gregory MacDonald, the creator of the Fletch novels.
Oh.
And a lot of these people, Richard, I just reached out to and said, and again, like I said, this is what I'm doing. And
well, Fletch is very well known for being a humorous detective novel. And
right.
I think when your dad actually interviewed Nero Wolfe, your dad asked Nero Wolfe, what is missing in some detective fiction? And Nero Wolfe said, humor.
Right.
And of course, Fletch and Gregory MacDonald was a very humorous take on the private detective.
Yeah. So this was Rex Stout.
I'm sorry.
But Rex really was very much like Nero Wolfe. But yes, Rex Stout always thought that there should be more humor in mystery novels.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see a little in the Sherlock Holmes novels, and if you like Victorian humor, I think it's there. And Holmes, of course, is a very compassionate character.
Yeah. Well, he started in about 1887, I believe, with The Study in Scarlet.
Yes.
I believe that was his very first one.
Right.
Might not have been the most famous. Hound of the Baskervilles obviously is one. Yeah. But from the British angle, he was one of the forefathers of the detective novel.
Oh, yes.
Here in the States, maybe Edgar Allan Poe might have been at the vanguard of that, although he never saw himself as a detective writer, but
no,
he definitely laid the groundwork.
Yeah, I think he thought of himself more as a poet.
Yeah.
But in the Mystery Writers of America, they give out the Edgar Allan Poe Award. And
that's right.
That's where
that's right.
Poe really is credited with creating the modern detective story.
Right.
So
now, in each section, you kind of introduce, or you give a little introduction to each chapter. We mentioned there was a chapter on dialogue, the creative process, portrait of a novelist, the writing process, the writing habit, the challenges. Now, you give little excerpts, and you wrote these under kind of a very specific environment. Can you describe a little bit about that?
Sure. When I was offered this contract, and I said, sure, I'll do it, before I really even thought about it. And I was battling cancer at the time, so I was in one different doctor's office after the next. And as you can imagine, sometimes when you go to the doctor's office, you have to wait. So I would be armed with a pad of paper and a pen, and as I waited, I would write the introduction to these tips. And when I would come home, I would type them up, and they would go through that writing, revising, editing process. But a lot of them were written in doctors' offices, and many times, when you're going through a battle like that, you're not really feeling at your best. And I would say, I'm going to write the opposite of how I feel. I'm going to make these very, very positive tips. And it was literally, I mean, even as I talk now, I can think of, I can see myself writing some of these tips and where I wrote them. And I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, well, this is really an inspirational book. And one of the people I was really, proud of that was Hank Philippi Ryan, who is also a fantastic novelist. But she
does Channel 7. She's also a news anchor.
But she's a great novelist and has done very, very well. And I asked her if she would give some tips, and she, again, very graciously agreed to. And she came up to me after, she goes, this is really an inspirational book. And I'm laughing to myself because I knew under the conditions I had written it. And it's probably the first time I've ever spoken about that. Publicly.
Well, speaking of inspiration, your most recent book is called Positive Results, as I mentioned previously, True Stories of Inspiration and Hope for Cancer Fighters and Caretakers. Now, I believe you were diagnosed back in 2005. Is that approximate?
Yes, that's correct.
And you had just lost both your parents from cancer, I believe.
Right. Both my mother and father died in 2003. They both had cancer. They ended up dying 6 days apart. I was their primary caretaker for about 1.5 to 2 years. And these are two people who knew each other their whole lives, you know, and they died, as I said, 6 days apart. And I had never written about that.
Is there a chapter about that in
Yeah, actually what I do is I have a chapter dedicated to my father and dedicated to my mother. And it talks, I give a thumbnail sketch of who they are, you know, some of their, you know, idiosyncrasies, but, you know, just a sketch of who they are and how they raised us and the fun times we had together.
But also, there's a couple chapters in here about you individually, how you fought cancer on 2 occasions, I believe.
Yes.
Not only in 2005, but after you healed from that situation, you had at Mass General. Was that at Mass General the first time?
The first time was at St. Elizabeth's in Brighton.
But then you went away, you joined the Army at age 41, and you went to Afghanistan.
Yeah, I figure, you know, you have to do these things when you're young. You know? So I go in when I'm 41. I was the oldest guy at Fort Jackson, let me tell you.
Yeah, well, Robin Moore, one of the people that in 101 Habits and who wrote the Green Berets, actually went to Vietnam when he was 40.
Right. You see, when you said emulate writers, I thought like I had to go to war too. So I'm emulating Robin Moore. No, he was 39 when he trained with the Green Berets.
I see.
So I knew it could be done.
Yeah.
You know.
But some of these chapters here about your personal struggles are really not only inspirational, but just heart-wrenching, really, about some of the interferon treatments that you had and the way you couldn't eat anything. You have one chapter in here, a story about the 800-pound saltine. Can you describe a little bit about that?
Sure. I had, this would have been February of 2006, and I literally could not even hold down water. I would have to, I would vomit water. My nausea was so bad. And I don't think this is atypical of interferon treatment, which I don't believe they do anymore. But in any event, I would go to the hospital every day and I would have to get hydrated. And I couldn't even keep down the nausea medicine. I would vomit that. And at one point, the doctor advised me, he goes, you know, you're going to reach a point where we can't turn this thing around. And that just was like I say in my essay, it was like a bucket of ice water going over my head. It just woke me up that doctors can't save you from everything, that some of it has got to come from within. And I just remember in the middle of the night, sitting on my bed, it's freezing cold because we have an old farmhouse and rattling windows, and I'm just sitting there trying to eat a sardine. I mean, not a sardine, thank God it wasn't a sardine, a saltine. And I'm just nibbling at it, and I'm doing everything in the world I can to keep it down. But that is the first thing I really remember eating for about 30 or 40 days. I just couldn't eat anything.
And then from that you graduated to spaghetti?
I literally one morning boiled one strand of spaghetti, and I ate it. It was tough to keep down. I went out for a walk at about 5 in the morning. It was one of those situations where I couldn't sleep, but I couldn't stay up either. You know, it was a strange period, and I actually wasn't even able to write about this until probably about 2 or 3 years ago. I just started writing about it. I wanted to write about my mother and father, and then as I wrote about them, I remembered little incidents that happened in my own life, and so I came up with about 12 essays.
Yeah. Well, they're very, although personal, I mean, they hit home because they are universal too. There's several, both of us know several people who have been through cancer, and of course a lot of our viewers know people or have themselves been through cancer. But after you came back from Afghanistan, you had a second bout. The cancer reappeared.
Yes, I wasn't feeling myself when I got back, so I went to visit my doctor, and turned out I had a very, very large tumor. I had 4th stage melanoma. It was positioned in a place where I had 4 doctors tell me that it was inoperable. They were able to get me on treatment. The tumor shrunk, but it was still inoperable. So finally, I went to Mass General, and I found a surgeon who was brave enough to take a chance with me, and here I am. But this, yeah, it happened a few months after getting back from Afghanistan. And
One of the chapters in here, one of the personal stories, is about where you go out to a cemetery and you purchase 2 plots. I don't mean to get too
No.
melodramatic here, but I mean,
we're talking about plotting today, so let's, you know.
yeah.
So,
Despite the heaviness of the theme or the subject, I mean, your interview, or excuse me, your chapter or personal story is a little humorous about how you meet with the maintenance person there at the cemetery, and how you go over the different plots and how you decide to go ahead and buy one.
yeah, she was a terrific lady, and there's that line from Tennessee Williams, the kindness of strangers.
Ah.
And I went out and I said, I'm going in for a pretty serious operation, which some pretty well-respected doctors told me that couldn't be done. So I said, I better go out and get a grave. I don't want to leave any unfinished business here for my brothers to take care of. And so I met with a woman down in Duxbury, and she, showed me around the cemetery, and I was wearing my 1st Infantry Division hat, and she told me her dad was in the 1st Infantry Division in World War II. So right off, we just hit it off, and I forgot why I was there. But it was just, it was a, as strange as it sounds, it was a comforting experience. And I wanted to write about this young lady and what she does on a day-to-day basis to help, people in this type of situation. It's like they say, no one's getting out alive. So,
Right.
so and there were just special people in the world like her who we don't always get time to credit.
Or appreciate that.
Yeah, and appreciate.
Behind the scenes.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, you've written several other books. I mean, you have Positive Results is your most recent, but you're also editor of Coast to Coast, which is a collection of private eye stories. Now, you have some from not every state, but just authors from just about every.
Sure. Just
from the West Coast, East
right,
Coast.
A little backstory on that. I edit that with a terrific writer, Paul D. Marks, who's also a Shamus Award winner from the Private Eye Writers of America. But he and I became friendly because we're both short story writers, and we just connected over the internet. And we wanted to do a story or a group of stories from pretty much for 15 different cities in the country.
And so you solicited authors.
Yes, we invited authors to contribute stories, and we got some great authors in there. We have another great Boston writer I like is Tom Donahue. Yeah. He's the author of Fraternal Bonds, and he contributed a wonderful story that takes place in Western Massachusetts, and really interesting, which he's very knowledgeable about.
Now, aside from being a novelist, an essayist, and an editor, you also work for the Department of Correction as an attorney.
Yes.
Has any of your work there influenced your writing at all?
No, I actually shy away from that because we're not allowed to. But interestingly, I haven't ever really written about corrections.
You do have a private investigator series.
Yes.
And the most recent of those is called Fatal Deeds. And this is a private investigator in Concord, Massachusetts by the name of Gus Churchill.
Yes.
Can you describe a little bit about Gus?
Gus is a septenarian. He's a retired sheriff, and he doesn't want to spend the rest of his, the final act, plucking dandelions and trimming bushes. So he decides he'll open up a private eye office in the town of Concord, or what I call Concord Farm, and it's what we would call a malice domestic novel. It takes place in a small venue. It's a confined novel, but I really wanted to write about small town America. I wrote the first draft of this novel probably about 3 weeks after 9/11. It's not based on 9/11. We don't reference it at all, but I wanted to capture small town America because I think we all felt like maybe we would never have small town America again. And I wanted to write about it as I saw it. And Gus is just, you know, he's just a champion of his town. He loves his community. He loves the people in it. And when bad guys come into the confines of his community, he's going to do something about it with his trusty administrative assistant, Happy Fremont.
Well, there's quite a bit of dialogue there that's quite entertaining between the two of them. You practice what you preach.
Well, I think, and just referencing my mom and dad again, I did, I think, base my characters on my mother and father.
I see. Yeah. And a miscellany of murder. What is this
So this
collection?
This is a collection done by the Monday Murder Club, which is the writers group I belong to. And another great Cape Cod writer in there is Stephen Rogers. Paula Meunier was the acquisitions editor from Adams Media at the time, and she pulled this book together. But this really gives a history of crime fiction, everything from TV to movies to novels, different crime fiction authors, and we just give one little essay after another about really the whole field.
Yeah. Well, 101 Habits is certainly something that a young novelist would gain from. There's plenty of information in here, and it's very generous. You're very generous with all the tips and all the writers. It must have taken quite a while to compile. There's a foreword written by Bill Pronzini, Grandmaster Mystery Writers of America. So we want to highlight that, and to young writers out there, you don't have to be young, but any writer out there could certainly benefit from this. Coming up with ideas, knowing what makes a great story, developing dialogue, overcoming writer's block even, in promoting yourself.
Right.
But mainly here, most recently, The Positive Results is a very, very heartfelt book about the surviving of cancer. And it is extremely poignant, and it really, really hits home. And I would highly recommend this to anyone who has any association at all with this terrible disease. Of course, throughout the years, cancer has been compared with TB, and we beat TB pretty much, but hopefully we will do the same with cancer. Andrew, I want to thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
It was very entertaining, and thanks, and continue
Thank you,
writing.
sir.
We want to hear from you again.
You shall. Thank you, sir.